Welcome to Growth Faculty and to this special free event marking International Women's Day 2024. We're a professional learning platform featuring the world's brightest minds, and I'm your MC, Christine Kinmonth. A warm hello to you if this is your first ever event with us, and a special hi to our members. I'm coming to you from the northern beaches of Sydney on the lands of the Guringai, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to leaders past, present and emerging. Well, in a moment, Rabia Siddique will take us through her inspiring story and her hopes for a fairer, more diverse and more inclusive future. Rabia's masterclass is going to run for 1 hour, so please do give her all your attention for that time if you can. We are recording this event and Growth Faculty members can watch the replay in the on-demand library. And a big hello to you if you are watching or listening to the replay. For those of you who are here at the live event, you can chat to Rabia and to each other using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We've got a lot of people on today, so please do use the Q&A function button for all your questions to Rabia, not the chat, please, if you can, and that way they'll stand out. You can also vote up the questions that you would like Rabia to answer as well. Now, let me introduce Rabia Siddique. Rabia is an international humanitarian lawyer, retired British Army senior officer, former war crimes and terrorism prosecutor, and hostage survivor. She was decorated by the late Queen Elizabeth II for her humanitarian aid work and has authored a memoir, Equal Justice, My Journey as a Woman, a Soldier and a Muslim. She's an exceptional speaker to make International Women's Day 2024 a memorable one, and it's an honour to have Rabia Siddique with us. Before I hand over to her, Rabia has a short video that she'd like us to play.
2005 in the terrorist hotspot of Basra, Iraq, where Rabia, an Australian lawyer with Muslim heritage, was based in the British Army. When 2 British soldiers are taken hostage at a notorious police compound, terrorists refuse to negotiate with anyone other than Major Rabia.
The soldiers were being held that the violence started.
She's choppered into the middle of an angry mob, where Rabia gets an agreement to set the soldiers free. Then, outside, all hell breaks loose. What she could see was British soldiers engulfed in flames. Inside the compound, Rabia is now also taken hostage. Then, in a smash-and-grab rescue mission, British forces regain control.
Some reports say British forces used tanks to break down the walls of the central jail.
But for Rabia, the triumph is short-lived. While her colleague is awarded the highest military honour, Rabia's role in the incident is erased from the records. In a David and Goliath legal battle, Rabia takes on the powerful UK Ministry of Defence for discrimination and wins. Her fight for equal justice grabbing headlines around the world.
Greetings to you all. Christine, thank you for that kind introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be a part of this Growth Faculty Impact series and to be your speaker as we celebrate International Women's Day this year, 2024, where of course the theme of International Women's Day is investing in women, accelerating progress. I'm incredibly excited to be joining you today, and for those that will be later watching the recording of this presentation. I understand that there are 24 countries, people from 24 countries that are joining us live at this event. So thank you and welcome to you all. The title of my presentation is Leading Cultural Change, Accelerating Progress, in line, of course, with this year's International Women's Day theme. For those of us that are in Australia, what I would like to do first is to acknowledge the traditional owners of this beautiful land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend those respects to any First Nations people from Australia and from around the world that are joining us here today or that are listening to the recording. I'd love to know if you can use your Q&A button where you are joining us from today and the lands of which people you are joining us from. So as you do that, Let me just set the scene. You will have seen the introductory newsreel, and that will just give you a little bit of a flavour of what I'm going to be sharing with you in our time together today. When we speak, however, about our First Nations people, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, they have been sharing stories for over 60,000 years as a way of reaching and teaching, as a way of uniting people and igniting their hearts and their minds. And I can think of no more powerful vehicle than the vehicle of human story to impact positive change, to accelerate progress where it's needed, and to mobilize us and inspire us to embrace our capacity to be the best version of ourselves and to improve our environment and our workplaces, our communities, our homes, and the world around us. So I share with you through this vehicle of storytelling my story today. But I do so very much with the understanding that a story is just a story unless it is relevant for you, unless it can shine a light on topics and themes and issues that resonate with you, that you can incorporate meaning from and value from, and take that value and meaning into your journeys, into your stories as you walk from this place. So that's what I will be hoping to do in our time together. And then, of course, afterwards, there'll be time for questions, answers, and hopefully a more intimate and informal discussion about some of the things that have been raised during our time together. So I guess, like most good stories, the best place to start is at the beginning. And like many of you, I am from a rich and mixed ethnic and cultural background. My father is an Indian Muslim. My mother is an Anglo-Saxon Australian. They met in the late 1960s, fell in love and got married at the time when the union between two people from different countries, cultures, customs, and even from different colours was very much frowned upon. I came along a little bit later, and I was the eldest of two children. I spent my early years in India, where my father was based at the time, but as I was approaching school age, my parents, like many immigrants around the world, made the very brave, courageous decision to leave their comfortable life in India, to transfer, to fly across to the other side of the world in hope of a bright, healthy, prosperous future for the family. And that was probably one of the most profound gifts they gave me, because I, like most of you, find myself living in a land where there is so much comfort, resources, and freedoms that I can take for granted. For millions of people, particularly millions of women and children around the world, these things that we take for granted will never be a reality. So we arrived in Australia at a time when the policy of the day very much required those that came from foreign shores, particularly non-European foreign shores, to check our differences at the door, to blend in, to become invisible, to fly beneath the radar. And that's what we were told was how we would eventually get accepted into the community as new Australians. It was easier said than done, particularly for those of us that came with brown skin, with a foreign accent, and with an unusual name that people could barely pronounce, let alone spell. And like many migrants, my parents both worked 2 jobs and long hours. We started life in a very working class, poor, modest neighbourhood. And I was the only child up until the age of 8. We had no family around for a support network. I suspect eventually, I was joined at the age of 8 by my little brother Adam, and that was to shut me up because I'd been nagging my parents for a little brother or a sister for a long time. So eventually Adam came along, and he was my ray of sunshine. I absolutely adored him. Because my parents had no support around them and they worked long hours, one of my jobs as I got a little bit older was to look after Adam a little bit here and there until one of my parents could take over. Now, we lived next door to an elderly couple, and this elderly couple really took Adam and I under their wing, so much so that we became fond of them and started referring to them as Nan and Pop, if you like. Nan and Pop became pretty much our surrogate grandparents, but what I didn't understand was that there was an ulterior motive for Pop's love and kindness, because you see, Pop was a pedophile, and Pop sexually abused me for many, many months. And this part of my journey that I share with you, this very raw personal part, comes of course with a trigger warning. If this causes any of you distress or discomfort, please feel safe and comfortable to leave this link up. But if you decide to stay and watch and listen on, please, I urge you, if you haven't already done so, speak to a mental health professional or at least someone you know and trust. Because the stats tell us that at least 1 in 3 of us will have suffered some form of sexual abuse, usually at the hands of someone we knew and trusted, and invariably when we were children. So I speak of this part of my journey unapologetically, deliberately, but with a heavy sense of responsibility, because I know that this will be a trigger for some of you, for many of you. But I speak of this part of my journey because I truly believe that if we are to embrace and to share our human stories to impact positive change and progress, we must be willing to share not only the beautiful truths, but the ugly truths. It's only when we are willing to bring those things that were in the darkness out into the light that we have been able to impact change, to shift important narratives. So when I was a child, we didn't speak of such things as sexual abuse or mental illness. And so for those of us that suffered, we felt as though we were suffering alone and nothing changed. It's really only been in the sharing of stories by brave people in the last 10 or 15 years that we have been able to shift the narrative. So we no longer speak of such things in terms of stigma and shame and secrecy and humiliation. We now thankfully speak of such things in terms of truth-telling and resolution and justice and healing and change. So for a very long time, Pop sexually abused me. And for all of that time, I suffered in silence because I understood that as long as I remained quiet and didn't speak of what Pop was doing to me, I could protect my little brother from the same fate. And this is how life went on for what seemed like an eternity. Until one day when everything changed. And I remember the day very well. It was the summer vacations for school. And my parents had gone to work early that morning. And when Pop heard them both leave the house, he came over to our house, as he usually did. And on this day, when he had finished with me, Adam and I were at home alone. Adam was not quite 2 and I was not quite 10. Just as he was about to leave via the front door, Pop turned to Adam and looked down at him with the same gaze, the same expression as he had looked upon me all those months previously. And I knew in that moment that my silence could no longer protect my little brother. I knew that I had to do something different. I had to somehow find my voice and speak up. And so I convinced Pop to leave, and I took a deep breath, and I picked up the phone and I called my mum, who was at work. And I'm showing my age, ladies and gentlemen, because that's how we used to hold phones then. Can some of you remember? So I rang my mum, who was at work, and as soon as I heard her voice, the tears just uncontrollably flowed down my face. And I said the words that no parent should have to hear. And I know that my mother was mortified. And I know that moments later, that when she rang my father when he was at work and told him what had happened, he was heartbroken. So cut to my next memory of that day, and it was hearing my parents' hushed voices behind a closed lounge room, living room door. And eventually they came out and they invited me in and they sat me down on the couch, on the sofa, and they held my hands and they explained to me that they had been agonizing over what to do. They explained that this abuse would bring untold shame and stigma and humiliation on me as an innocent child and on our family, still a family of outsiders, not quite accepted into the community yet. And so begrudgingly a decision was made, which was not an uncommon one for back in those days. And that was to sweep the abuse under the family rug, to never speak of it again. The police were never called, Pop was never brought to justice, and I was told never to speak of what had happened to me, to anyone. And I didn't for a very long time because I was a young girl believing my parents were protecting me. And you know what? They were, the best way that they knew how. They weren't monsters. They, like you and I, were the sum of the product of their experiences and their culture and their generation and time. But what they couldn't understand would be the impact that that decision would have on me. The impact of that decision left me feeling incredibly powerless. The impact of that decision left me feeling overwhelmingly voiceless. And the impact of that decision would be what would inform and influence every major decision that I would make and choice I would take in my life after that. It would inform and influence my values, my morals, my principles, and the way that I would see the world. So I want to ask you at this point to reflect on your journeys, your stories, and ask yourself, What life-changing, what life-shaping experiences have you been through that you can now reflect on and identify as those that have informed and influenced major decisions and choices that you've taken in your life? How they've shaped your values, your principles, how you see the world, your purpose, your why, how you are in relation and in relationship to people, and maybe even your biases, your prejudices, because we all have them. It's so important when we gather on occasions like this that we take the time to look back in order to understand from where we have come, to gain greater insight and awareness before we can understand and appreciate where we are today, and then before we can plot the course for a better, brighter, more inclusive tomorrow. So that's what I'm asking you to do now, and as you continue to reflect on that, let me continue. So fast forward to a time when this girl is becoming a young woman and I'm struggling, and I'm heading down a path where the abuse could have easily not just damaged me, but consumed and destroyed me. And that's when I am fortunate, through the support and the love and an environment that's created for me, where I finally start believing that I am worthy of better treatment than I had received. That I finally start believing that I am not what happened to me, that I am not defined by the worst of my suffering. I am what I choose to become. I'm the author of my own destiny. And so I make a key decision in my life that it's time to get into the driver's seat and out of the passenger seat of my life, and to turn what's happened to me, the abuse, the injustice, into a positive legacy for change in my life and hopefully in the lives of others that I would serve and help. And eventually I would decide that the vehicle through which I would do this would be the law. And for a number of years after qualifying as a lawyer, I practiced in Australia, and I was so privileged to work with incredible communities that taught me a lot about humanity. Asylum seekers and refugees, victims of family and domestic violence, remote, regional, Indigenous communities. And all the while there was this voice inside my head that was getting louder and louder, that finally I identified as the voice of my calling me to even higher duties, to practice, in fact, as a humanitarian lawyer, to serve, to advocate for people that were suffering the most appalling human rights abuses. People that lived in parts of the world, however, where justice and equality were foreign concepts. And so in the late 1990s, I decided to listen to this voice, and I left Australia bound for the United Kingdom. After a number of years of living in the United Kingdom, I decided that I was nowhere near closer to accessing the people and serving those that I truly believed I was meant to help and serve. And so I decided to leverage and harness another vehicle of service, and that was the British military. I decided to apply for, and surprisingly, was eventually accepted as a legal officer into the British Army. So you would have heard the expression, timing is everything. Well, that would turn out to be very relevant for me at this juncture in my life, because the week that I would complete my military officer training, the week that I would commission as a captain and a legal officer in the British Army, would turn out to be the week of the 11th of September 2001. 9/11, as we have commonly now referred to that devastating day. I'd like to ask you, all of you that are joining me here today or on the recording, who remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard of the terror attacks? I'm so encouraged to see that most of you remember that, because increasingly as you get older, and I'm 52, I find myself in rooms and environments and in theatres where I have to ask the question, who was old enough to remember that day? So thank you for making this middle-aged woman not feel old today. I remember too. I remember exactly where I was. I was at London Heathrow Airport, and I was waiting to board a flight back home to Australia, where I literally had 3 days at home to sit down with my family and explain to them why I had taken this crazy decision to join the British Army, that it was the means to an end, that as a legal officer in the British Army, I would have the opportunity to deploy to places where people desperately needed help. And as I was at Heathrow Terminal, I was looking up at the screens. I'm sure you know the ones with arrivals and departure information, wondering why every screen said delayed, cancelled, until I came upon this one screen that had been switched from flight information to the live CNN news. And I got to this screen in time to see the second tower fall in New York. And as I looked up to look at the second tower fall, I had this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach that our world was about to change in ways I simply couldn't foresee. What I wouldn't appreciate is that my world would also change in ways I could barely have predicted. So fast forward a number of years again, and I am surprisingly adapting well to military life. I've been deployed to a number of places around the world, and by now I've been promoted to the rank of major, which is the first of the senior ranks of the officer corps in the army. And the military gives me another unexpected gift. I meet through my work, fall in love with and marry my then husband, a British Royal Air Force officer. We marry in the July of 2004. In the September of that year, I get another call, because we're still holding phones like this, from a senior officer in my corps, the legal corps, who rang to tell me that I had been selected for a very important role. That I had been selected to be the sole legal officer to support the British contingent in Iraq the following year on what we called Operation Telic. And that my role, it was explained to me, was twofold, was to provide international and military legal advice and support to the Brits and the Allied forces, and also, secondly, to work closely with the Iraqi authorities to help them rebuild, re-establish the rule of law, law and order in their country. And I was gobsmacked to get this call, because you see, the reality was that there was many officers in my legal corps that were far more experienced and senior to me. And I would be the first woman to carry out this role, and the cultural significance of that hadn't escaped me either. So why, I thought, was I selected for this job when there were so many more qualified? Did it have something to do with my Muslim heritage that I would share with the people I was about to serve? Maybe. Did it have something to do with the fact that I spoke a little bit of Arabic that would prove useful? Perhaps. All I knew for sure is that I'd been given an incredible gift, an incredible opportunity to serve as I had dreamed of serving, and I had to grasp it with both hands and be worthy of it. And so at the beginning of 2005, I deployed to Iraq. And my tour of Iraq was a tour essentially of two halves. The first part of my tour, up until about the July of 2005, the environment in Iraq was quite calm. We had freedom of movement. I was able to do some important work and make trusting and build respectful relationships with some of my Iraqi friends and colleagues. And we were able to do some important work and make some progress together. But then in about the July of 2005, everything changed. The infrared technology that was in Iran made it across the border. And that was behind the explosive attacks that then started going off all around Iraq, killing thousands of innocent civilians and hundreds of military personnel. Everything changed at this point. The situation in Iraq became volatile, dangerous, and quite frankly, terrifying. It was this part of the tour that I want to take you to now, and you've seen snippets in the opening newsreel. I want to take you to the 19th of September, 2005. Now, early that morning, I arrive at my headquarters at Basra Airport in the south of the country. To some very troubling news, to hear that two of my colleagues, two Special Forces soldiers, had been that morning kidnapped, beaten, and illegally detained. And they were being detained at a place called Al Jamiat in Basra city in the south. Now, Al Jamiat was famous for two reasons at the time. First, it was the official largest headquarters of the Iraqi police service. Second, it was the unofficial headquarters of an Iranian-backed terrorist group called the Jaish al-Mahdi. Now, at this point in time, the Jaish al-Mahdi had completely infiltrated the Iraqi police service, and they were responsible for most of the explosive attacks. So you had a situation in Iraq where the country was being run, policed, governed, if you like, by terrorist police officers, if you can imagine what that felt like for the civilians. And I knew something in addition about Al Jamiat at this point, because now the International Cross had been forced to pull out of Iraq. So I had been appointed by the British government as their proxy human rights inspector. And part of that role was to conduct unannounced visits and inspections on various facilities around the country where we suspected human rights were being breached. And through this role, I was aware that Al Jamiat was holding over 300 innocent Iraqis illegally without charge, many of them being tortured, some never seen again. So it was bad news that our two guys were being held there. But what could I do about it, right? I was just the lawyer in uniform. The tools of my trade were my brain, my words, my pen. I'm not trained for this sort of scenario, but I have a colleague based at the headquarters with me. His name is James. He's also a major, equal rank as me, and he is trained for this scenario. He's been in the infantry for many years and trained in intelligence. He's ordered by our commander to get on the next helicopter and to take the 15-minute flight with a group of men to provide him with security into Al Jamiat and do whatever was necessary to secure the release of our two men. So off James goes. And about 45 minutes later, he sends a message back to our headquarters via a radio that he'd smuggled in. He explains that the Iraqis had done something similar, that they had sent their own representative in, an Iraqi judge, as it so happens. And the judge, when he arrives at the compound, says to James, "I've got no interest in speaking to you. I'm not going to have a dialogue with you." So James, after a while, asks the judge, "Well, sir, who will you speak to?" And the judge says to him, "The only one that I will have a conversation with is the only one of you that I have some trust for, the only one of you that has shown us, my people, any respect, that has taken the time to sit down with us and to listen to us, to listen to our concerns and our fears, to listen to our hopes and aspirations for our people, and then to ask us how they can serve us, not spoken over us and been arrogant and pointed the finger at us and told us what we needed and how to get it done." James said to him, "Sir, of course, you tell me who that is and I'll get them for you." The judge said to him, "You send in Major Rabia and I will speak to her." Awesome. So on the strength of that, my commander orders me to get on the next helicopter and to fly into Al Jamiat, to take over from James and to lead what we now understood to be hostage negotiations. And I am petrified. I am quite literally shaking in my boots. My legs feel like blocks of cement. I'm terrified. I remember thinking, I am the worst person to be asked to do this job. I am going to get myself shot and killed. I'm going to get James shot and killed. I'm going to get our two colleagues shot and killed, the judge shot and killed, everyone in that compound killed. In fact, I'm going to single-handedly bring down the Iraq campaign. Now, I was prone to a little bit of exaggerated thinking, but you get the drift. I was genuinely terrified. And that's when my dad's voice came into my head. My dad is a wise man. And he used to say to Adam and I as we were growing up, "Kids, there will be times in your life where you'll be called upon to step outside of your comfort zone and to do something uncomfortable for the greater good. And the decisions that you make in those moments will define your character." My dad used to speak a lot about character. Now, you know, when you're young and you haven't really lived a life where you understand those words of wisdom, I remember thinking, yeah, thanks, Dad. But now when I needed to hear it the most like divine inspiration, those words came to me. And I finally understood what my father was talking about. He was talking about a moment like this. So what was I going to do? Well, I had no choice. The lives of my two colleagues, like it or not, rested on my shoulders. So despite the fact I wasn't trained for this scenario, I had to step into the discomfort. So I took a deep breath and I grabbed my equipment and I ran for the next helicopter. And as we were hovering over the compound, waiting for a safe place to land, I was greeted by a sight I wasn't prepared for. You see, there'd been a story that was leaked out into the Basra community that they were holding Israeli spies inside of Al Jamiat, and that whipped up a frenzy. And by the time I arrived, there was about 300 locals that had surrounded the compound and they were screaming for blood. And about 80 to 100 of my colleagues and friends, British soldiers, had been quickly sent to Al Jamiat to try and keep the crowd calm to stop a riot from erupting. I managed to jostle my way through the crowd, who were throwing rocks and glass at the British soldiers, who were firing their weapons in the air. James met me at the gates. He took me into the compound where the judge was waiting for me. The judge and I greeted each other in Arabic, and then the judge turned to James and said, okay, you go now. Now, I didn't want James to go because he was my security blanket. So eventually I get the judge to agree to allow James to stay. But the judge's condition was that James had to keep his mouth shut. I could live with that. So then I had to get the judge to agree to take me to the cell where our two chaps were being held. So there was about a dozen of these terrorist police officers that were standing guard, and we were marched down right to the other end of the Al Jamiat compound, where we came upon this double stone cell that had a big metal door. The metal door was opened, and we walked inside the cell, and I noticed a little slit of a window in the cell where the sun was beaming in. And then in the far corner of the cell, I saw our two colleagues, and they were bloodied and they were bashed, but they were alive. Their wrists and their ankles were chained, and they had hoods over their heads in breach of all the international conventions. So immediately I asked for the chains to be removed and the hoods taken from their faces. And as the hoods are lifted off their faces, I saw the two men look around, and they saw the judge, and they saw James, who they recognized and gave him a nod, and they saw the terrorist police officers, and then they saw me, and they couldn't hide their shock. They kind of recoiled backwards, and they looked me up and down slowly, and then they looked at each other and raised their eyebrows. And then they looked back at me and looked me up and down. And then they realized that I was watching them, watching me. And so they kind of pulled themselves together and forced out this pained smile. But I knew what they were thinking. These poor chaps were thinking, holy moly. Well, probably something stronger, but I'm in polite company. Is she the best the British Army can do for the likes of us, two elite killing machines? Because if she's the secret weapon, then we are screwed. And I've got to be honest with you, I had a fair degree of sympathy for that sentiment. But I couldn't say anything because I'm still trying to maintain my air of authority and confidence along with the judge. And so I just stare at the two men and I meet their gaze and I look them in the eyes and I try and give them the most warmest smile I can muster. And what I'm trying to say to them without words is, chaps, I'm terribly sorry. But yes, it is. Yes, I am. And quite possibly, yes, you are. And with that, at this stage, the judge and I had agreed that I would take a set of actions, that I would meet a set of conditions in return for which he would release the men into my custody. And this procedure took about an hour. And just as we had finished agreeing the last condition that I was writing on a release contract, if you like, just as the judge and I had pens in hand and we were about to sign this release contract, all hell broke loose around us. I could hear rocket-propelled grenades going off in every direction. I could hear these blood-curdling screams and what sounded like glass smashing. And in the tiny slit of a window in the cell, I could see flames. And the flames were so ferocious, I could feel the heat emanating off these flames. What I didn't realize until later was those flames were the flames of my colleagues and friends outside on fire. The crowd outside had now grown to almost 2,500, and they were storming the compound, having set fire to the British soldiers that had been trying to keep them calm. And in what sounded like a herd of 1,000 elephants, as the crowd broke down the final wall, everything changed in the cell where we were at. The police officers revealed themselves now to be the terrorists we suspected they were, and they grabbed their rifles, they cocked them, and they pointed them at James and I and our two colleagues. The two guys were thrown back into the corner and their chains and their hoods were replaced. James and I were dragged out of the cell. And the judge, looking around at what was happening, turned to me and said to me in Arabic, "I'm sorry, Major Rabia, you and I, we are no longer in control here." And he grabbed his papers, he put them in his briefcase, he turned around, he ran away, and I never saw the judge again. James and I were dragged down the other end of the compound where we started, and we were thrown into a cell. And within about half an hour, the door to our cell opened up and 4 other men were thrown in with us. Actually, 4 British SAS soldiers who had sneaked their way into the compound hoping to get us out. But sadly, they had been caught and they were now thrown in with us. And there was about 15 to 20 terrorists standing guard in our cell. And so now in our cell, there's 6 of us. And I'm the only woman. I am the only one with Muslim origin, and I am the only Arabic speaker, all of which up until that point in my service had served me well. But now at the hands of our terrorist captors, Because of those traits, I become the prime target. I become the worst traitor, as they called me. I become the whore, as they would refer to me. And for the next 8.5 hours in front of my 5 male colleagues in this cell, I'm degraded, I'm humiliated, and I'm tortured. But at the 8.5 hour point, miraculously, in a combined American-British operation, we're rescued. And it is indeed a miracle, because not only just the 6 of us, but also our 2 colleagues, all 8 of us, lived to tell the tale of that dreadful day. And I guess if this was, I don't know, a Hollywood film, this would kind of be where you would expect the credits to roll, right? Because Hollywood loves a triumphant ending where the supposed good guys get to fly off into the sunset. Well, we did fly off. It was almost sunrise. But as we know, life is not filled with triumphant Hollywood endings. And what should have been the end of the most traumatic incident of my life would unexpectedly herald what would become the biggest battle of my existence. We returned to our headquarters, and all 8 of us were told that we were going back to the headquarters building where all the headquarters staff had assembled to welcome us. All 7 of my male colleagues that were held hostage were ushered into the building first, and I'm told to hang back outside and just to wait next to the glass doors of the HQ. And I look around to see what's going on inside, and as the 7 male colleagues of mine are ushered in, there are cheers and there are applause from all the headquarters staff. There's a lot of handshakes and a lot of backslaps going on. And eventually, after the cheers die down, the 7 of my male colleagues are ushered into a room for what we call in the military debriefing. You and I would know it as trauma counselling. Standard procedure when you'd been through something like we had, something as appalling and as traumatic and as terrifying. Then a young officer comes outside and says to me, "Major Siddique, you can come in now." And I thought to myself, gosh, I'm getting my very own welcome. That's amazing. And I walk in and there's no cheers. There's no applause. I don't recall ever receiving a handshake or a pat on the back. My commander comes from the back of the lobby of HQ and he greets me in true British fashion with a cup of tea. He then gives me a peck on the cheek and he hugs me, and he'd never done that before. And he does that in front of all the headquarters staff, 80% of whom also reported to me, because keep in mind, I'm now a senior officer. And he then says the word, "Siddique, you must be awfully tired. Run along back to your tent and don't hurry in this afternoon or tomorrow." No acknowledgement of the role that I had been ordered to perform that day. No recognition of what I had been through for 8.5 hours. And he knew, because he'd been briefed, and it was also very obvious from my physical state what I had endured. No debriefing was ever offered to me either. And the silence in relation to my sheer existence in the days and the weeks to come was simply deafening. And I couldn't understand what I had done wrong to deserve this treatment. And the feelings of confusion eventually gave way to feelings of anger and betrayal and abandonment. But I was still in Iraq, and I was in Iraq to serve, and to serve the Iraqi people, so many of whom were still enduring the most abhorrent human rights abuses, worse than anything that I could imagine, even now with my woes. And so I had to suck it up, and I had to soldier on. And that's what I did to the best of my ability until the end of 2005, when I was safely returned to the UK. But I was returned to the UK a broken person. I was returned a shell of my former self. And I didn't realise how broken I was until the following year, the year of 2006, which would be the year that almost broke me. And I'm going to give you a little sense of that year. Realising now how precious and fragile life was, my then husband and I decided we wanted to start a family. I was fortunate. I got pregnant quickly. But at the 4.5-month point, I was diagnosed in very extreme circumstances with a very dangerous ectopic pregnancy. I was rushed to hospital and I spent a long time in hospital. One day when I was in my hospital bed, my then husband brought an official-looking envelope that had been sent to our address in for me to see. And I opened it up and it had 2 pieces of paper in it. And I read the first piece of paper and it was a citation. "James, you will remember, James was awarded a military cross by the late Queen Elizabeth II, and I was thrilled for him as I read his citation. I was excited for him and so proud of him. I finished reading it and I put it down on my hospital bed. My heart's going, racing now. I'm sweating, I'm excited, I'm trembling. You can imagine what I'm thinking. And I open this second piece of paper and I read it and I read it again. And I read it for a third time because it took 3 readings for me to understand what it was. You see, it was a written order from the most senior commander in the armed forces, ordering me never to speak of the role that I had performed at Al Jamiat. It's what we called in the army a gag order. And as I read it for a third occasion, I had an involuntary flashback. I had a flashback to 10-year-old Rabia. And I remember thinking, it's happening again. I'm being gagged and silenced again. Is this my lot? Is this the best that I have to look forward to? As a woman, as a Muslim, as a minority, is this what life is meant to look like? Even as someone who has dedicated her life to the law, trying to do good, trying to make something good out of something horrendous. And I remember thinking, it can't be, it mustn't be. I mustn't allow myself to be silenced again. But 2006 wasn't finished with us yet, because 3 weeks after I recovered, my then husband was diagnosed with cancer. And the diagnosis wasn't great. He was given a 20% chance of surviving. And as we wrestled with this, the nail in the coffin came. Out of the blue, I got a call from a dear friend and colleague of mine who risked his career, in fact, to ring me from Iraq where he was still serving, to give me some important news he knew I would want to know immediately. He rang to tell me that my closest Iraqi colleague and friend, his name was Asaf. He was the husband of a beautiful, intelligent university academic, and they had 2 gorgeous children under 4. My colleague in Iraq rang to tell me that Asaf had been murdered. And I knew instantly that I was responsible for Asaf's death, because you see, the year before I had convinced Asaf to work with me and alongside me in exposing the human rights abuses of his people. And when I returned safely to the UK, Asaf so bravely continued this work pretty much on his own, which made him the prime target for the terrorists. And that's why he was shot twice in the back and executed. And when I heard the news, all I could see was Asaf's blood on my hands. And all I could think of is that I would now be the reason for why 2 precious children under 4 would grow up without their daddy. And on that day, in that moment, my world went dark. I fell to my knees and I didn't want to live another second. Because all around me, all I saw was darkness and chaos and misery and pain. And pain is all I felt. When have you been on your knees, my friends? Because we've all been there. When has life felt too unjust, too hard, too painful, too overwhelming, where you didn't know if you could or wanted to carry on? But you're here with me now. You're here with me now celebrating this important occasion. So the next question I have to ask you is, who are the people and what are the things that held you, that supported you, that gave you purpose and a reason to keep going when you didn't think you could or would? Because they are the people and those are the things that we must keep close and hold dear. When we talk about this thing called resilience that we are asked to build and to practice, particularly us women in this world that we live in today, the resilience that we are called upon to practice every single day. Despite what he was going through at that stage, it was for me, my then husband, and he peeled me off the floor and he held my hands and he said the words, "My darling, you are broken and you need help." And to hear those words from him was a gift, because now I finally understood what I needed to do. And I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. And that was a gift, because now my demon had a name, and I could set about the work of confronting my demon in order to overcome and finally heal. And thanks to some amazing healthcare professionals, that's what I did. And eventually now, having healed and rebuilt myself up from nothing, now I was ready to right this wrong. Because if this was happening to me as someone who was not only 20 years older, but educated, someone who dedicated their life to the law and truth-telling, for goodness sake, someone who was a leader, because that's what I was now, and people looked at me to lead from the front, to set the tone and the culture, to lead in alignment with my values. And I had privilege, I had a voice, and I had influence. And if this was happening to me with all my privilege, goodness knows how others without that, without a voice, were being treated. So now, having rebuilt, I was ready to right this wrong and do something uncomfortable and impact positive change. But it took me 2 years, and I exhausted every avenue of redress available to me. And at the end of every path, the door was slammed in my face until there was only one avenue left, one path, which would be extreme, which I knew would be the end of my military career, but I had to take it. And that was to mount a discrimination case against the British Armed Forces and to sue the British government. And that's what I did. The press called it a David and Goliath battle. I called it hell on earth. My case took 2 years to get to court, but finally I had my day in court, and what do you know? I won. But the win wasn't in the win, if that makes sense to you. The win was in the lessons from the journey. Within 3 months of my case being heard, the floodgates opened and hundreds of other similar discrimination cases came through the tribunals and the courts. Within 6 months of my case being heard, the first woman was awarded a military cross, and that fundamentally changed the whole dialogue about the role of women on the front line and as first responders. And within a year of my case being heard, there was an independent investigation into the Army, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, and that led to profound changes in legislation, in policy, in attitudes, and importantly, in the culture around the way women, minorities, LGBTIQ plus people were treated in the military. And those changes were replicated about 5 years later in the British public sector. The win would be my greatest life lesson: the power of the one. The power that we all have, you and I, to create ripples of change. Mother Teresa said it best when she said, "I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the water and create many ripples." And it's this ripple effect that I am convinced, and I have come to learn and truly believe in my core, that we are all capable of creating if we choose to do so. So that's my story. And I said to you at the beginning of our time together that a story is just a story unless it resonates with you, unless it is relevant for you and shines a light on topics and themes that you can find meaning from, you can find value and inspiration from, and incorporate into your journeys as you go forward from this place. I hope I've been able to achieve that. And I hope I have been able to give you some inspiration so that you truly believe that as we celebrate this International Women's Day, that you can embrace your capacity to create change and, in the words of my hero, be the change that we wish to see in this world. But if I can leave you before we move on to our intimate conversation and Q&A session with my key learnings to reflect on as you go forward from this day and as you continue to reflect and celebrate International Women's Day. My key life lessons, all roads for me lead to this. The first is this: we must choose to confront our realities, accept and respond to this new world we're living in, and confront the beautiful as well as the ugly realities. Acknowledge how much work has been done towards equity, diversity, and true inclusion, but recognize and acknowledge the work that is left to be done by us, because with our privilege comes responsibility, by us to create a more positive future for the next generation. Number two, We must choose to challenge and, if necessary, change our perspectives. You don't have to be held as a hostage in a war zone. Every day we are holding ourselves captive by the limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves, about others in the world around us. We have blind spots. We all have bias. We must check those and have the humility to challenge and change them, and to see challenges as opportunities for change, as opportunities to drive greater equity, greater inclusion, greater diversity and belonging for all. Number 3, we must protect hope at all costs. Faith, belief, hope that we can impact positive change, that there is nothing that is insurmountable. We must keep the flame of hope alive, and we do that by focusing on and acknowledging and always looking for the silver linings and the belief that we can do better. People look to us to do just that. And finally, number 4, when it really counts, or as my dad would say, for the greater good, we must be willing to do the uncomfortable. We must choose to do things differently. Stand when others remain seated. Speak up when others remain silent. Call out, hold to account, challenge laws, systems, processes, conduct, culture, attitudes, behaviours that are not serving everyone well, that are not serving our girls and women well, that are not serving our minorities and our First Nations people well. Because we must take everyone on the journey with us. We must, as this year's theme tells us, invest in women and invest in a greater way towards women. And we must accelerate progress. Women and girls have the basic human right to feel safe, to access good healthcare and education, to have equal choices to men, to have equal opportunities to men, and to be able to realize their dreams. But it's up to you and I. We all play a part, and it's down to us all. Thank you, and happy International Women's Day, and let's have another chat soon, in a couple of minutes.
Well, that was absolutely incredible, Rabia. And I know that a lot of people are here with questions for you. Everyone was on mute, but I know looking at the chat and all of the comments, you could really hear a pin drop, I guess is the best way to describe it. Your story is so powerful. Everyone's saying amazing, amazing, powerful, powerful, incredible. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And there's so many questions, so many comments and amazing people responding to your extraordinary story. So thank you for that. And I think when you said, you know, we must focus on hope, if anyone is able to say that out loud and mean it, then we can all do so. If you can say that, so well done. So questions are coming in, and I really do want to go to the question around, Anthony has asked, what an inspirational story, Rabia. Sued the British government and won. After all the trauma you'd already faced, how did you find the strength to stand up against so much injustice? A lot of people in your circumstances would have given up. Was there a moment when you felt inspired to stand tall?
Anthony, thank you for the question. It's a great question. I think I touched upon it when I was presenting to all of you. I was very conscious of my privilege and the position that I was in, and that people were looking to me to demonstrate and to be clear what's right and wrong. And I knew that if this is how I was being treated, that others must be in such a worse predicament. So I guess I've always believed that with privilege comes responsibility. And I think also I've been very blessed to be very, very clear in what my values are, and tried very hard to live a life in alignment with those values. So that's where I drew my strength from, the profound belief in my values and the fact that I had to live by them, and the fact that it was incumbent upon me as a leader to do the right thing and to step up, not just for me, but for others who couldn't. And I had the incredible belief and support of my loved ones who encouraged me when others disappeared, when it felt lonely, and had complete belief in me that I could stay the course, I could do this, and that they would be there by my side.
So people are voting up various questions, and the one that's voted up the highest is, what happened, from Simon, what happened to the army officer who told you to go and lie down in your tent? He says he's desperately hoping that something uncomfortable was done to hold him to account.
Well, when I brought my case to court, it was fairly historical because it was a case that called the most number of senior officers to give evidence in any military case brought to court at that stage. Of course, things have moved on since then. So he did experience some discomfort because he was expected to give evidence in a public court. Last time I heard, he was still in the army. I think he had been promoted. But after my case, there was a very public apology. There was an investigation, and there was an acceptance that lessons had to be learned. And what I should say also is that it's important to acknowledge that he wasn't actually responsible for the ultimate decision. I found out many months after my case was decided that the decision to gag me and write me out of the whole incident was made by Prime Minister Blair and his cabinet at the time. It was decided on the very day of Al Jamiat, when his cabinet met in an emergency meeting, that if we were all to survive, that it must never be made public, that I, a foreign female Muslim lawyer, was sent in to lead what became one of the pivotal events of the Iraq campaign. I was seen as a political hot potato and an embodiment of everything Prime Minister Blair was being criticised for at the time. So it was a political decision.
Fascinating, and really good to get that perspective on what actually went on. Thank you for that. Vanessa has asked, this again is voted up. Did your colleague James ever acknowledge the horrendous disparity in how both of you were acknowledged and treated?
No. But I truly believe that we all live with our own conscience. And whilst he didn't publicly acknowledge it, I would like to believe that there was some reflection by him at some point, and maybe even some discomfort.
I think we're all very surprised to hear that. So wow, what an answer. Wendy has asked again another very popular question. How did your parents reconcile, or even were they able to, that hand-holding conversation all those years ago that you were sworn to never talk about, with the extraordinary life-changing role model that stands before us?
As I said when I was speaking before, it's really important to understand that my parents weren't monsters. You know, it was a very different time then, and they were the product of their time, just as we are now. And it was a very common decision. People didn't have the language, the words. You know, we didn't speak of sexual abuse. It was in the shadows. And they were so committed to trying to make a good life for our family and trying to get us accepted and integrated into the community. So whilst it will be something that will have a lifelong impact on me, I kind of understand the position that they were in. Of course, would they do things different now? I'm certain they would. But my parents have told me a number of times that the child becomes the teacher, and that I have, and it's very humbling for me to hear from my parents, who I greatly admire and love, that I have taught them so much about leadership, about values, about integrity, about courage, and they are very proud of me. So, you know, you can't have regrets. Life happens and it makes us who we are, and what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. I truly believe that. And growth comes from discomfort. There's no shortcut around that.
And now, of course, you're teaching us so much. So thank you for this. So we've got time perhaps for just one or two more. We are going to go a little bit over time, but I hope that's okay. Jenny's asked, and a lot of people want to know, what happened to your husband?
Oh, Jenny, that's a great question. So there is a happy ending to this story. Miraculously, because my life is full of miracles, he did survive after his operation and treatment. He did beat the odds, and he did survive and went on to beat that beast called cancer. We are no longer married, but we are very good friends. But while we were still married, of course, you can imagine with my ectopic and his cancer, we didn't think that we would be blessed with children, which was our dream. But in fact, in the lead up to my court case, only weeks before my case was heard at court, we discovered that a miracle had taken place. We had to go down the IVF route and we discovered that I was pregnant, but I parent on steroids because I am the mother of what is now teenage triplet sons. So we went on to have triplets in 2008, and we beautifully and harmoniously co-parent our almost 16-year-old triplet sons together now.
And I know that in all your bios, you often say that they're your proudest achievement, which is wonderful.
They are, Christine. And can I tell you, staring down terrorists and being in war zones was actually just a training ground for raising triplets.
Everyone's saying congratulations, wonderful to hear about this happiness. And they're saying, I was crying before and now I'm really crying. You are amazing and you're going to set me off. So perhaps it's a good time to pull it to a close. Rabia, you've been incredible. Thank you so much. It's such a personal story and you can see how much it's touched everyone so personally. And I think it's really brought International Women's Day to life for us. It's very easy to sort of, oh yes, gender equity and rights and justice. But I think when you see what happens when there is no justice, the personal effect it has on somebody. So thank you so much for making that so obvious to us today. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Growth Faculty. Thank you, Christine and Karen from Growth Faculty. And thanks everyone for joining me. It's been an absolute honour. And again, happy International Women's Day. Please remember, when you invest in women, you lift up a whole community.
Hear, hear. Beautifully said, beautifully closed. All the lovely thank yous coming through. Thank you, thank you, thank you in the chat. Everyone's thrilled to bits, so really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for your wonderful responses in the chat. I've been trying to keep on top of them, but there's been some amazing stories also coming through there too, very personal ones too, I've noticed. So we do welcome your feedback. You'll notice in the chat there is a feedback form to fill out, and we would love to give away to one lucky person Rabia's book, Equal Justice, My Journey as a Woman, a Soldier and a Muslim. So do fill in that feedback form and let us know what you think. Certainly, I know there's going to be a lot of positive responses in that. So next week, we've got a very apt follow-on event. We've got a panel discussion on resetting your workplace culture for 2024. It's going to be moderated by the CEO of the Executive Connection, Stephanie Christopher, and we've got speakers from the Culture Institute, Reese Group, Beyond Blue, and Tennis Australia. Before I go, I do draw your attention also to our Good to Great Immersion workshop with Jim Collins in Chicago in October. So Jim Collins has had more impact on global businesses than almost any other thought leader, and he's very, very rarely on stage and a very compelling speaker when he is on stage. If you can, I urge you and your executive team to get to Chicago for the full day workshop. There are details on our website, growthfaculty.com. Well, on behalf of the Growth Faculty team, thank you for joining us for International Women's Day 2024.